Let us all pray together. God of revelation, mere flesh and blood cannot reveal divine truth. Only your Spirit can give that gift. Be in my breath and my voice, be in our ears and understanding, that through these words your word may be known. Amen. Our Old Testament reading this morning is from the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 8 through chapter 2, verse 10, and that can be found on page 49 in your pew Bibles in the Old Testament section. Last week's reading told us of how Joseph brought all of the Israelites down to Egypt to survive the famine that was in the land. And now many years have passed. Joseph has died, the Pharaoh he served has died, and the Israelites are learning that times bring change. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, the Egyptians sent taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Siphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the banks of the river. The child's sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." The epistle reading this morning is from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. This is in the New Testament section of the Pew Bible on page 161. Paul had never been to that church, but this was his letter, essentially of introduction to it, and it kind of lays out, this is what it is to be a Christian. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function. So we, who are many, are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us: prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. Our gospel reading this morning is from the book of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 13 through 20, found in the New Testament on page 18. Jesus and the disciples have been traveling throughout Galilee. The disciples have seen Jesus perform many miracles, and today he's putting the big question to them. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And the disciples said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The word of the Lord.
A Jewish rabbi, of which Jesus is one, wrote an insightfully altered perspective on creation. He wrote, "On the third day of creation, just before all forms of life were about to multiply, the Holy One said to his creatures, 'I see that what some of you treasure most is survival, while what others yearn for most is adventure. So I will give you each a choice. If what you want most is stability, then I will give you the power to regenerate any parts you lose, but you must stay rooted where you grow. If, on the other hand, you prefer mobility, you also may have your wish, but you will be more at risk. For then I will not give you the ability to regain your previous form.'" Jesus and his disciples came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus asked, "Who do people say that I am?" Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets, the disciples said. "The people say we prefer stability, the familiar, things we know, things which are reliable. John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the familiar prophets." Then Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." the Messiah, the Christ, the opportunity for that which has not been but will be and is even now. It is one thing to believe that the Messiah will come one day. To say that the Messiah will come one day but not yet is to have or to think one has a comfortable yet unchallenging reality, an excuse not to enter the struggle against the great and little evils, or not to recognize them, or to rationalize them away. It is one thing to say that the Messiah will come one day. It is quite another to say the Messiah is here now. The time of opportunity has come. Then it makes a difference how we live. No longer can we hide or rationalize a failure to join the Messiah who is here. Jesus explains that what entering on the Messiah's side will mean. It means to take up the cross and follow Christ. Then Jesus describes life as it is. Those who would save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for Christ's sake will find it. Or as the rabbi says in his creation story, those that chose stability we call trees, and those that chose opportunity became animals. Those who would save their life will lose it. One pastor tells this story. I once had a parishioner in mid-career who came to me for advice. He felt dissonance between his work and his church. He thought he should change to something less war-oriented. To help him think through the implications, the pastor pointed to the hardship this would cause his family, the fact that we were not currently at war, and so the weapons were defensive. After some months of wrestling, he decided not to change. Years later, he found the pastor again. His marriage was breaking up. He took an early retirement and spent his time building a cabin in the mountains. The pastor went on, I have wondered since whether his life would have been more fulfilling had I just encouraged him to act on his faith, to have done the works his faith required. Those who would save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for Christ's sake will find it. One daughter shares this memory of her father. The young man who was to become my father came to this country at the age of 2 from Puebla, Mexico. His father had left the Catholic faith to become a Methodist minister and chose to work with the underprivileged in the States. Albert developed into a bright, conscientious, attractive, hardworking kid with a deep respect for his parents and for God, and an insatiable curiosity about everything. He lived in Brooklyn, and when he was 19, preached in his father's church there. Her father started off intending to become a minister too, but he changed his mind in favor of mathematics and finally physics. He was working his way through school when he met the girl's mother. After they were married, they moved to Stanford so the father could work on his master's degree in mathematics. Her parents bought a huge house where they could rent out rooms to boarders when her father student taught and continued to work on his PhD. At that time, most of the bright young Stanford scientists went off to Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the atomic bomb was being developed. Her father recognized the potential destructive power of the unleashed atom even in those early days, so he took a job as a research scientist at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Soon her father was invited to become head of operations research at Cornell. Exactly what the job entailed was classified information, but he was offered a 3-week cruise on an aircraft carrier as an introduction to the project and promised a huge salary. By now, her father had begun to ask himself whether, with the overwhelming capacity of the A-bomb to wreak total ruin, if there was any such thing as defense. As he struggled with the question and with the lucrative offers that would assure him and his family comforts thus far unknown to them, the mother suggested that they change churches. They had joined the Presbyterian Church in the West. But now the mother shepherded them to the Quaker Meeting House in Buffalo, hoping to help the father find some spiritual guidance and direction. As for the father, whose struggles of conscience had drawn them to Quaker meetings in the first place, in that austere silence, he became a pacifist. Rather than get rich in defense work, he would become a professor. They would never have all the fine and useless things that little girls want when they are growing up. Instead, they would have a father with a clear conscience. Decency would be his legacy to them. Those who lose their life for Christ's sake will find it. That description of life is connected to the Messiah who is here and who this Messiah is. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Peter said. And Jesus began to teach them that he must suffer many things and be rejected and be killed and on the third day rise again. To be the Christ means to suffer. To be joined to Christ, to lose our life for Christ's sake, and thus to find it, means to be joined to the suffering of Christ's crucifixion, and so to be joined to Christ's resurrection. A little girl was once asked, if you could be anyone in history, who would you like to be? She said, Joan of Arc. But of course, I would not want to be burned at the stake. The little girl wanted to be famous, but without having to do anything for which to be famous. She wanted to be a celebrity, to have fame without effort, to have the benefits without paying the cost, to save her life, but thus to lose it. Of course, not to be burned at the stake is not to be Joan of Arc. To be Joan of Arc, not burned at the stake, is to be like any of the anonymous people who fail to see or to respond to the moment to decide, who in trying to save their life lose its meaning. Hugh Latimer, an English cleric, looked out at the congregation one Sunday and saw sitting there the King of England. The king was Henry VIII, who was a man to be reckoned with if the Archbishop of Canterbury and Henry VIII's wives are any indication. The king was a powerful man, familiar with the uses of that power, even to the point of murder in order to get his way. Latimer saw the king in the congregation and said in a stage whisper loud enough for everyone to hear, Latimer, Latimer, be careful what you say. The King of England is here. If Latimer had been interested in survival and stability, that would have been a good place to stop. He paused and then he said, Latimer, Latimer, be careful what you say. The King of Kings is here. To live a life which says that Jesus is the Christ, that the Messiah is here in this life, your life and my life, is not simply in heroic ways, but in ordinary ways of being good and kind that are perhaps unnoticed except by us. To lose one's life for Christ's sake, to decide to join in Christ's suffering, and to act on those decisions, to leave as our legacy not all the fine and useless things we want, creature comforts thus far unknown to us, but to leave decency as our legacy. And if the rabbi's description of creation is right, when we make that decision, we will not be able to go back to who we were and regain our original form. Who do people say that I am? The world would allow easy accommodations to avoid the suffering of Christ. But as Jesus told Peter, that is not God's side. Who do you say that I am? And that is Jesus' question to you and to me and to the church this day. It makes a difference to say the Messiah is here, to look at the power and influence of the world and to say that the King of Kings is here. In one of the workshops at an educational event I attended, the discussion was about the mission of the church and how it has been confused and sidetracked. Among the thoughts shared is this one. What has happened in the modern Christian discussion about the afterlife is that instead of placing the emphasis where the New Testament places it, which is on the new heaven and the new earth once Christ returns, we have focused on heaven and hell. And this one. Jesus wants to save us from making the good news about another world and not this one. Jesus wants to save us from preaching a gospel that is only about individuals and not about the systems that enslave them. Jesus wants to save us from shrinking the gospel down to a transaction about the removal of sin and not about every single particle of creation being reconciled to its maker. Jesus wants to save us from religiously sanctioned despair, the kind that doesn't believe the world can be made better, the kind that either blatantly or subtly teaches people to just be quiet and behave and wait for something big to happen someday. The Bible begins with Abel's blood crying from the ground. The Bible ends with God's wiping away every tear. No death or mourning or crying or pain. Hope. The church is always about hope. I was reminded of my earlier days in West Virginia. In coal mining, the coal company owned the mineral rights to the coal. They owned the houses that the miners lived in. They built the church and they hired the preacher. It is fairly easy to guess what kinds of sins the preacher preached against. Sloth, gambling, drinking, anything that would keep a miner from doing his job. It is also fairly easy to guess what kinds of sins the preacher stopped short of preaching against, such as the sending of miners into mines with inadequate or no safety protection, treating them as if they were interchangeable and replaceable pieces of equipment instead of human beings. To preach against those sins would get the preacher fired. It is as if the preacher said, "Preacher, preacher, be careful what you say. The head of the coal company is here." All the while forgetting to say, "Be careful what you say. The Christ, the Son of the living God, is here." And the church served the coal company, not the living God. Emil Brunner said, "A church exists by mission as a fire exists by burning." Robert Weber in the Young Evangelicals said, "The calling of the church in every culture is to be mission. That is, the work of the church is not to be an agent or servant of the culture. The church's business is not to maintain freedom or to promote wealth or to help a political party or to serve as the moral guide to culture. The church's mission is to be the presence of the kingdom. The church's mission is to show the world what it looks like when a community of people live under the reign of God. The face is important because it serves as a mirror. When I was growing up and did something that displeased my parents, I only had to look in their faces to see it. When I did something that pleased them, I could tell by the look on their faces. The same is true of God. There are over 400 references in the Old Testament to the face of God. And there is a sense in which we are the face that God shows to the world. When the world looks into the face of the church, what does it see? When people look at Lakeside Presbyterian Church, what do they see? Do they see that the Messiah is here? What should they see? I believe when people look at us, what they should see reflected back is God so loved the world. In your life and mine, as individuals and in our life together as a congregation of God's people, by the way we live, what does our life say that Jesus is? It makes a difference how we live our lives because the Messiah is here. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Amen.